the students that are joining us today. And just a brief introduction. My name is Carrie Longley. I'm an associate professor of fine art and campus art director. I want to recognize Nathan Kuznia, our gallery and studio coordinator for installing Whitney's exhibition. Whitney, your pieces have gotten a lot of traffic in the Meyer Art Way, lots of great feedback, and I think you've even sold a piece. So that's great news. Before I leave it to Whitney, I'd like to explain a little bit about her background. Whitney Lee Sage is a multidisciplinary artist and educator originally from Metro Detroit, currently serving as assistant professor of art at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois. Whitney attended Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and graduated in 2008 with a bachelor's degree in art education and painting. And one of our students joining us today is from Oxford. So awesome. That's fun. Whitney earned an MFA in studio art from Sam Fox School of Visual Art at Washington University in St. Louis in May 2011. Whitney's work, which includes practices of painting, drawing, sculpture, fibers, and installation, has previously been featured in several solo and two-person exhibitions and notable group exhibitions at the Painting Center, Superfront LA Gallery, the Lexington Art League, UICA, the Muskingum Museum of Art, the Kennedy Art Museum, and the Denos Museum Center. A selection of Sage's recent work has been recently featured in solo exhibitions at Workhouse Art Center, Art Reach, Mid-Michigan, Roy G. Biv, and Ripon College. Whitney has been an artist in residence at Pops Packing, the Vermont Studio Center, Wave Pool, and will be an artist in residence at AIR Paducah in summer of 2022. Whitney's creative work has been featured in a number of publications, including Manifest's INDA 14, Refract Journal, Our Detroit Magazine, Woman Arts Quarterly Journal, Newfound Journal, Make Magazine, and the Post-Industrial Complex Catalog, published by the Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit, as a survey of makers in the Detroit area. You can see her exhibition, The Spaces Between, in Meyer Artway in Whitewater Hall on IU East Campus through Friday, April 22nd. Welcome, Whitney Lee Sage.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And I would just like to thank you and Nate for hosting me and for inviting me to exhibit in the space. It's a wonderful opportunity and a wonderful space. And I'm not actually in IU Eastern's hallway, but I've made it my virtual background. So those of you who aren't affiliated with the school and might not get a chance to see the exhibition, you can sort of see it in my virtual background here. But thank you for joining me. I'm gonna kind of go through and talk about the evolution of my work that kind of thematically builds up to the work that's on display to provide some context. When speaking to an educational audience, I always like to provide sort of the series that kind of built up to where I'm now, just so especially students can understand where the work came from and the evolution of bodies of work, and can sort of understand it through the lens of how it came to be. But I'll leave plenty of opportunities for people to ask questions and to respond at the very end. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I have my contact information here on the slide. So my website is just my name, and you could follow me on Instagram as well. So the first thing I always think it's important to kind of talk about is location. I'm originally from Farmington Hills, Detroit, which is a suburb of Detroit, located about 22 miles from the city center, about 10 miles from the border of Detroit. And it's important for me to own that I'm from Metro Detroit, that I'm from suburban Detroit, because context really matters in terms of the city. So for me, growing up in Farmington Hills, I was growing up in a completely different county outside of Detroit, Oakland County, which up until 2010 was one of the wealthiest counties in the state of Michigan. And so it's important to kind of realize the contextual difference of growing up in Farmington Hills versus growing up in the city of Detroit. And so it's important for me to own that it is a privilege for me to have grown up in the suburbs of Detroit. And it's also really important for me to authentically own that my point of view is informed by a suburban point of view. And so for me, it's important to own that and not to misrepresent myself as someone from the city proper. I had a very different experience. I had resources and opportunities that would not have probably been available to me if I had been raised just 10 miles down the road. Distance is also important in terms of understanding where the work came from too. So when I first started making my work in grad school about the city of Detroit, I was living in St. Louis, Missouri. So I was away from the city, and I was really starting to make work in response to how I was hearing Detroit reported about from afar. So it was a very surreal experience, having grown up in the metro area, having gone downtown with family for outings to sporting events, to go down to the Detroit Institute of Art, and to have this really kind of unique and beautiful sort of memory of Detroit, and to see it sort of represented from an outsider point of view, it was really jarring to me. So I've included some examples of what came to sort of be known, not my term, as the ruin porn phenomenon, which were these really epically tragic looking images that became really popular around the time Detroit declared bankruptcy. And so images like the ones we're seeing here became really common in news media, and also as subjects by artists as well. And so for me, seeing images like this became really heartbreaking through the way that they are accurate images. They're images that really exist within the city of Detroit, but how they really fail to capture the entire picture of what Detroit is, what it's like, and it really just showed a very, very different point of view than what I had sort of experienced and remembered. And so the first series of works that I'm going to speak to are a few bodies of older works. And they all kind of relate to this idea of critiquing the representation of Detroit. So a lot of my earlier works were in response to media representation of Detroit. And the idea behind the pieces were to really look at the lenses in which we view each other, the lenses in which places are represented, and to really expose the inaccuracies or the tropes that are being relied upon in these representations. And so this series, the Ruin Porn series, was made between 2010 and 2011. And what I was doing in the works was I was appropriating some of these ruinous images that were popularly being used in media. I was printing them on fabric, and I was creating these sort of fiber pieces where I was adding paint, hand embroidered bead work, and the goal being to really sort of embellish and sort of exploit the sort of visual attraction that the images had inertly had and that the original artist or photographer was representing, through almost this kind of more is more form of beauty. And so the idea about taking these images that were already being manipulated through framing and through editing to be made to look tragically beautiful and to kind of push it even further to the point of almost the grotesque. The idea was to sort of expose the way the images were being manipulated, as well as the ways that we were being attracted by those manipulations on a really tactile, in a really tactile manner. And so through my own sort of additions and edits and through the appropriation, it's meant to really expose what's being done even in those original images. And so these pieces are meant to have these sort of a seductive quality. I use soft, really sort of inviting materials that invited touch and invited closer look. And you might even recognize the image that this one came from. And it's actually the image that you're seeing that was on the Time magazine cover I showed earlier. And so the work was all about critiquing these very gaudy, ostentatious, very overly dramatic images, and really the reliance upon them by media. They weren't showing other images. They were mainly just showing these. And so they weren't really showing the whole picture of what was happening in the city and what life was like for those who lived there. So a body of work that came sort of out of that, you'll sort of see I'm somewhat moving kind of from older work to newer work, but you'll see I jump around through the presentation, is this next series called the Misery Index, Greetings from Detroit, which I made in 2013. And so this body of work was made in response to something that I was seeing a lot after I had graduated grad school. So I'd graduated in 2011 and was in the search for higher ed positions. So I was spending a lot of time on websites like LinkedIn and job finding websites. And I was getting a lot of these kinds of articles targeting me. I was getting them sent to my email. I was seeing them linked on the sidebar of the websites I was on. And it was these ranking sites where they were ranking the 50 most miserable cities in America. And so oftentimes, without fail, Detroit was either an image that was going along with the article. And most of the time, Detroit was also ranked #1 or #2 of the most miserable cities in America. And I really took issue to this. It really made me mad. Because once again I felt a somewhat unfair depiction. It also for me was interesting, this idea that data could somehow be translated to an emotional state. How does one measure misery? And so when learning about the index that most of these articles were using, here's another one by Forbes with an image. It was often just demographic data that they were relying on. And some of them were understandable data, like rate of violent crime, poverty level. And then some of them were a little bit more interesting, like number of cloudy days and number of divorces. And so what was super interesting is that some of the data that they were using to determine that Detroit, in this case, is the second most miserable city in the country, just seemed ambiguous in some ways, and it kind of threw the question of the whole scientific nature of this study into question for me. And I think the thing that bothered me the most about it is that they were targeting me as a potential job applicant, as somebody who was on these sites looking for positions, where to go next, where to move, and thinking about who else was being targeted with this information, and how these stories were really undercutting the potential growth of a city like Detroit. Often also, including really problematic imagery in the case of this specific example too. I just found them incredibly unfair. And so that led me to create a series of postcards that were meant to address this form of representation, this idea of Detroit as a miserable city, and what it might be like to visit the most miserable city in the United States. And what would the postcard look like that you sent from the most miserable city? And so I created the series. They're scaled just like postcards. They're 5x7 or 4x6 in scale. They were modeled after some actual elements from real postcards. So the lettering was often taken from real postcards that existed. So I did some research into archives of postcards and looked for specific designs that I found appealing. And then the themes of each image were either directly related to a news article about the city of Detroit, or directly related to the misery index data themselves. So in the case of this image, And all of the series, I should say, are India ink, watercolor, and gouache on paper in terms of the material. This work was in response to a headline that had made a splash about a house in Detroit that had sold for $1. And it was all over national media about this $1 home. And you know, this idea of the housing crisis in Detroit as being shown as, you know, worthless. Everybody around the country is knowing about how you can buy $1 houses in Detroit. And so this postcard was in direct response to that article. Also happening at the time, the city had declared bankruptcy, and one of the challenging things that was happening is that because many of the works in the collection of the Detroit Institute of Art were actually owned by the city, in the bankruptcy proceedings, the interested parties had brought in appraisers to the Detroit Institute of Art to determine the value of the works owned by the city. And there was a lot of fear, obviously, that these grand works of art that make that collection incredibly important and impressive were going to be auctioned off at the highest bidder in order to pay Detroit's debts. And so this work was in direct reference to that, which was sort of going on at the time. So the background imagery is sort of a close-up of Diego Rivera's Detroit industry murals, which were in the museum. And obviously the verbiage, "Greetings from Detroit, see it while you can," was meant to reference that very real fear of the city being, you know, chopped and sold up for parts. And specific to this one, something that I remember that's like burned in my memory is, I remember reading an article about this where they said, well, you don't need to worry about the Diego Rivera murals because they're glued to the wall, they're fresco, so at least those won't go away. And I just, the mere idea that maybe somebody would try to find a way of chipping the work off the wall as a way of selling it off for parts was incredibly upsetting, and also just goes to show you the desperation of the situation. Now, luckily, things worked out well. We didn't have to sell works to settle the debts. The collection remained untouched, but it was something that was a concern to many of the people living in the area at the time. And so the rest of the series is all, like I said, referencing either the ambiguity of the misery index itself, or in direct response to newspaper headlines and coverage. So this postcard reads, "Greetings from Detroit, there are people here." And that was in response to a article that said, from Forbes, that was titled, "A Shocking Sight in Downtown Detroit, People." So this idea that a city that had, you know, 800,000 people living in it is being shown as some post-industrial wasteland where no one lives through media reportage was something that I thought was really important to critique and to expose. And so the last series in this kind of thematic lens of critiquing representation is my composition in D series. And so the three works from this series are, you can see them behind me. They're on display at IU East currently. So in thinking about misrepresentation and the way that the images being shown in media were creating almost this landscape of Detroit that in my mind exists, but not really as they're showing it. I sought to kind of create my own imaginary landscapes by cutting and pasting images taken from around Detroit and trying to utilize those images to sort of collage an image of the city that doesn't fully exist, as a way of exposing the way that these various little pictures in different medias are creating an image that doesn't really exist, that doesn't fully tell the story. And so these images were created with watercolor and gouache on paper. and were ripped from the original paper that they were on, and then recollaged together with other disparate images taken from completely different areas of the city. And so we have an image of a brush park home next to a pile of shoes that's actually was part of an art installation called the Heidelberg Project. And so through combinations of things that don't go together, that don't belong, I've created this sort of desolate, abandoned landscape that doesn't physically exist. And the idea through these creations was to create these somewhat mediated images to show the invented nature of how cutting and pasting and just showing singular images does not tell a whole story. And so this was a piece from the same series, as well as this one. And just a bigger image of the one from previous. So all the work I just talked about was kind of framed through this idea of critiquing the representation of Detroit. I started making sort of another series of work, sort of simultaneous to those series we just spoke to, through a different sort of lens of looking at the city, and through looking at the city's absence and the flight that had occurred and the aftermath. And so I like to show this image just to show the scale of the issue. So this is a chart that shows the population growth and then decline and sort of when it occurred. And so you can sort of see the incredible boom in the population between the 1910s and the 1930s in response to Detroit's real center as a place of industry surrounded around the auto industry in particular. So with all the jobs that the auto companies created, we saw incredible growth in terms of population, both from people living in the South who moved north for better opportunities, and from immigrant populations. That's a rich part of Detroit's history. And so something that that you can see is the incredible boom that expanded both the number of people living in Detroit, but also the amount of capacity and space the city itself absorbed. So the city got really big as a result of going from about 400,000 people to almost 1.5, 1.5 million. Yeah. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading. Didn't have enough coffee today. In really a very short period of time. And so the city really had to grow as a result of that. Something that people from Detroit like to talk about is its size, and its size is a really large part of the problems the city currently faces, because in order to house in single family homes this incredibly large population, the city really swelled. So it takes up about 138.77 square miles. It's enormous. And so the cities of Manhattan, Boston, and San Francisco can all geographically fit within the body of Detroit at large. And so it just goes to show you the sheer scale of the city if you've never been to Detroit before. So it's an incredibly large city. And as a result of that population decline that started to occur in the 1950s, and you can see really picked up, especially after the 1980s, that enormous city, lost a lot of people, mostly to the nearby suburbs that surrounded Detroit. And so what happened is with the incredible loss of people, in fact, about almost 50% of the population was lost in a period of about 50 years. We have opens, we have homes without residents. In fact, many residents abandoned their homes because they weren't able to actually sell them. The price of homes really bottomed out, and it really led to a lot of the issues that Detroit currently faces. And so this is an image here that shows you the percentage of vacancy in the city. The color obviously determines the amount of vacant parcels per that sort of section. And you can see the concentrations of the dark green as being areas where the most vacancy occurs. And so this is sort of an important thing to look at and to understand, because these are often the areas that I'm looking at in terms of my own work, the areas that have been most impacted by flight out of the city. And so instead of looking at it through this very mathematical, these graphs and forms, I want to really show you what that change looks like tangibly. So this is an aerial photo of Detroit, probably at its peak. And so you can see the incredible density of the residences, and how many homes were kind of just sandwiched in between one another. So it was an incredibly dense city for its size. And this is a contemporary image of what that same plot of land looks like now. And so obviously it's in color, it's a little bit different, but you can just see the vast amount of green space and the vast numbers of structures no longer present. And so the next body of work really aimed to connect to this idea of absence, because it's something that you're often struck by, especially people who lived in the area and have seen it change over time, is just the absence of people, and in this case also the absence of structures. Through blight removal projects, a lot of homes have physically disappeared, and so you just can go to some areas of the city where it just looks like vast urban prairie. You don't even really have any indication of what used to exist. And so work that I would been working on during my graduate school, this body of work was entitled My City, My Home, My Body. It was an idea of trying to connect blight and the degradations of homes to a more empathetic experience. Blighted homes often were looked at as eyesores, and I was trying to connect that kind of blighted structure with bodily degradation. And so the viewer could sort of see in the work, in the physical deterioration of the architecture, something that maybe intrinsically felt related to their own sort of experience of decline through aging. And so trying to normalize and make the image of the blighted home more empathetic to the viewer. And so I took these sculptures, which were made out of studs and drywall and digitally created wallpaper and plaster and found objects. And I actually brought them into the city of Detroit and placed them in areas where there used to be heavily dense residencies, to just kind of be these little monoliths that kind of relate to the absence of the home that is no longer present. And so these are some details of these works. And then I also made one that kind of reflected a body almost sort of gone in disappearance, a home that's no longer really even recognizable, except for little moments like these little kind of carvings that show evidence of the wallpaper that might have used to be on the wall. And I also brought those into it. So this idea of showing this sort of degraded home as being the signifier of the home no longer present in these spaces. Another body of work that sort of relates to this idea that was created in 2010 was this idea of making the absence tangible. So in this piece, I took a piece of digitally printed fabric that had a map of the city of Detroit on it, and using maps like the one I showed you previously that shows where the city has lost most of its density. I used fiber etch to literally burn out the parcels of land that were mostly over, I believe, 80% vacant, And so the areas where there's holes in the fabric are plots of lands that either no longer have density on them, or they were plots of lands that were destroyed in the construction of the interstate system. So some of these burned out areas are because neighborhoods were literally run through with 6-lane highways. And so those spaces are now lost also to history. And so I projected light through the burned out map, and it resulted in a map of the absence in the background. There's a detail of the sort of etched map. And so the map that exists in the background, which is just projected light through that map on a piece of chiffon that was hung on the wall, is meant to give this sort of ghostly spiritual quality to the map of absence that now exists. So making physically present what is no longer there. So another ongoing series, I'm getting into the work that's more sort of ongoing in what I'm doing currently, is a sculptural series called Domestic Fragments. And so this series of sculptures are found object sculptures that are using objects found on abandoned properties in Detroit. And I am either casting or dipping the objects themselves in plaster. And so the series of works are these sort of remnants of either the plaster casts of objects no longer in existence, or dipped plaster objects that do exist, taken directly from those homes. And the idea of the use of the white plaster is to kind of imbue them with almost a artifactual quality, as well as to start to make the context of the original object less known. And so making the objects less accessible as a metaphor for memory, and the way that memory and the lives and the people that once owned these objects becomes inaccessible through that loss of that context, through the loss of people and through the loss of that memory that ties these objects and these things to the lifetime of stories that they were connected to at one time. And so just a detail image. So this is an ongoing series that I'm currently sort of working through. It's often displayed in tandem with the last two bodies of work that I'm going to talk about that are also on display at IU Eastern. And so you'll sort of see some examples too of the works installed together. So in this theme of representing absence, my most recent body is sort of building off of where those earlier bodies of work sort of began. So through the act of painting and through images and archives, trying to capture an archive of what once existed in the city as a way of memorializing and having some sort of historical record of what exists. And so this series was started in 2016 and continues to this day. So I'll even show a few examples of where I'm going with it now. So the very first piece from this series is this piece, Victorian Mansion, created in 2016. The piece was actually more of an experiment than I didn't really start making the piece as the beginning of a series. I didn't actually even have a fully formed idea yet, but I'd bought a bottle of Payne's Gray acrylic ink that I really loved the color of, and I wanted an opportunity to play with a material I hadn't used before. And this idea of kind of the negative space as showing, as being a really nice, clear way of showing loss through this physical absence, this physical white sort of stain of inaccessible information, was something that I'd sort of been thinking about. And so I had taken an image of a Victorian mansion that was in pretty incredible disrepair. And the idea was, by voiding the image out, we could start to understand what it would be like to lose that tangible historical marker. We often think of blighted homes as a problem that needs to be fixed, and in a lot of ways that's true. They can be sites of crime. They can be dangerous locations, but they were once homes. They were once places physically occupied by families. And so I like the idea of instead of thinking about it through the removal of something bad, um, understanding what's lost when we remove all the markers of history and of communities that once occupied those spaces. And so getting us to kind of think about what's lost through revitalization and through tearing down of blight. And so this was the second piece from the series. Often attracted to these very sort of recognizable single family home shapes that Detroit is filled with. For me, they seem to be spaces that have the ability to draw viewers in that are even maybe not from Detroit and specifically, because the home styles and the shapes are no, I don't want to say universally recognized, but they're ones that are familiar to most viewers, and through that familiarity, there's the ability to recognize and to reflect upon and maybe empathize with what this sort of absence is demonstrating. So I like the idea of these middle class looking homes versus this very opulent mansion that also was a historical signifier of a time that really isn't reflective of the real larger population in Detroit, which is middle class or lower middle class individuals. And so I shifted more towards those types of homes versus the grand old mansions, as a way of really focusing on everyday people that are more reflective of where I come from, but also where most of my viewers would be able to kind of come from themselves. And so some of the works in this series, entitled Homesickness Series, do capture just the physical remnants that exist. I was sort of experimenting at the time with whether all the images needed to have these voided facades or facades, or whether, I wanted to focus on even what the sites looked like at that day. In this case, the home is no longer present, but instead of that white shape of the home not being there, I didn't know what that original home looked like. It was already gone by the time I saw this lot. And so this idea of not even having the memory of what that house looked like as being a different way of reflecting that loss of communal memory and of familial memory. So this work, entitled Cottage, just because the architecture sort of reminded me of a cottage, that especially that triangular transom shape at the top that I really enjoyed. And so something I was experimenting with this series was whether the entire facade should be voided out. I'll go to the next slide, which is the reference image I used for this painting. And I really loved the little decorative brickwork. I thought that was really lovely. It's not something I've seen on a lot of homes before. And it was really important for me in showing this image to give at least a little taste of what existed. And so I was kind of experimenting with this idea of showing the house in almost a transition of disappearing. And so having these little moments of clarity where you can kind of see what that house looked like, but then voiding out other areas as showing that disappearing quality. And so that was something I was sort of playing around with and experimenting with. And so there's the reference image original to the piece. This is a piece entitled Neighbors, the idea of showing that this isn't just singular houses on streets. In fact, there's oftentimes rows and rows and rows of endangered homes. So the idea that one day all of them might be torn down means that eventually that entire street could be unrecognizable to even people who grew up there. And so here is the final work. And here is the reference image that I used to create that. And so I really left a lot of that information out. I included little moments of tangible details, but I wanted to make sure to really show the loss. And I don't often show the reference images because I find the work to be more powerful when you really are at a loss to know what the original structure looked like. But for the purposes of sort of understanding my process, I wanted to make sure to show a few examples. And so oftentimes I'll show the homesickness series in tandem with the domestic fragment series. So you can sort of see that here. And so I like to kind of show those things side by side to explore the connections that can exist and between those two bodies of work. And so then the last piece I'll show that's in the gallery is this piece, Recession. Through this piece, I was really exploring the idea of the process of decline and the process of absence. So showing 3 houses in different degrees of absence by kind of connecting to that idea of the process of loss. And so we have the full kind of information of the image on the far left. We have some little moments of information in the center one, but on the right, the house has been left almost entirely voided out. And so this idea of becoming more absent as sort of happening across the piece, the building receding into memory. And I like that kind of double meaning of the title too. This idea of recession is also directly reflecting the economic issues that often lead to the loss of homes and the foreclosure crisis that really is at the heart of a lot of the vacancy in Detroit. And so 2 ongoing pieces to show you sort of the process. So I always start with a pencil line drawing from my reference images, if I have reference images that give me the full details of the image. So there's one current piece I'm working on, and here's another one, and kind of maybe about 30% done. So it's pretty early on. But I wanted to show sort of that process of the works kind of building up. So with the use of the India ink material, it's applied through really meticulous layering where the material really builds from light into more darks. And so you can see sort of the beginning stages of the work. And so if you want to see what these works turn into, you should definitely keep track of me on my website or on my Instagram. And so the last 2 pieces from this homesickness series relate to the idea of kind of experimenting early on in that series. I started trying out different formats beyond the rectangular format and focusing in on individual little lots. And so these pieces I mentioned, they are on display in the show, but I like to point them out because they directly led into the next body of work. I really enjoyed the shape that they ended up looking. I enjoyed the intimacy that round and that oval shape kind of created for the piece. I also liked the idea that it almost kind of created this effect of almost like a portrait of a specific location. And so I liked the quality of the roundness. And I wanted to explore that further. And so that led to the Portraits of Home series, which is another ongoing series that I'm doing that still relates to this idea of representing absence, but through sort of a different visual effect. And so these are ovular shaped works. These are much smaller in scale than the previous body of work I showed. So these all measure about 5 inches by 7 inches. And they are ink, the same sort of acrylic ink I was using in the previous series, but in this case, I'm starting to utilize color. And so I chose that ovular format for that connection back to almost tintype, the history of tintype photography and those sort of old historical images that you might have access to of your ancestors that were often shown in these sort of ovular frames. And I liked the idea of presenting the homes as a form of portrait, as a way of reflecting the individual stories and the families and the histories of the people that occupied those spaces. And as you can see from this image of showing all the series kind of installed, I also really missed color working on that previous series, Homesickness series. I love that Payne's gray color. It's a beautiful color. There's a lot of evocative purposes for the absence of color, but I just as a maker was missing using color, and I liked color's ability to connect to individuality. And so I wanted to do this series in color through this idea of creating something that felt individualized, that felt different from the one next to it, as a way of really reflecting the difference and the diversity that exists across the history and of various neighborhoods in Detroit. You'll also notice some of the pieces have the name Highland Park in the title. And so I really started to expand my range also to a city that's actually surrounded by Detroit. It's its own city, but it's a city within Detroit. And in a lot of ways, Highland Park has a lot worse issues than Detroit does, just because of it being much smaller and it not really having any industry present within its boundaries. So the tax base issue has been larger in Highland Park. And so the neighborhoods as a result too are in much worse shape than even in some of the ones in Detroit. So I've also expanded the series geographically to another related region. And so the small scale, I liked the idea of being able to execute paintings a little quicker. The problem with the larger works, which I love and I love working on, is that they're not very efficient in terms of time. Each one probably takes 40, 50 hours worth of labor to get it to a finished point. And, I wanted to be able to represent more of the city, more of the homes quicker. And so a smaller scale really allowed me to make on a much faster pace. So the images, in terms of how they come to be, are very similar to the previous series. I'm relying on either archival imagery from various public archives, or I'm relying on images I've taken myself. Most of these images were taken in 2016, 2017. And all the works are based off of images. Some of the homes have not fared well since then. So this is what the current lot that this home once stood on now looks like. This home was located in a city, or a part of the city, a neighborhood entitled Del Rey, which is south of downtown Detroit. It was a primarily industrial area, but there was a lot of residences right around that industrial area. And it's one of those dark green areas from the map where you saw a lot of absence and a lot of vacancy. And so you can just see in the difference of just a few years, how these homes are being lost and how there are no physical markers that remain of what once existed. And so here's two more works from the series. And so once again, here with 1616 Gray Street, this tree here is this tree along the edge here on the left edge. And so the home once stood on the right side of this image and is gone. And then two more works from the series. Now it's not all sad. Some of these structures still exist. So 4854 Springle Street is still there. So you can see what the lot looks like now and what it looked like when I took my reference image. So some homes still exist. And I'm also documenting through this series, I'm really focusing on the vacant lots too, from that very dense overhead aerial view shot that I showed you earlier. The spaces between the homes that remain become significant. That's part of where the title of the show came from. The spaces between is these places that no longer have clear markers of memory. And so through this series, I'm also connecting vacant lots with the addresses of where homes once existed as a way of of at least memorializing the fact that there once was a home. I don't know what that home looked like, what it might have been in a previous life. But through the work, I'm even connecting this idea of the physical absence through just the image of what now exists and what is accessible. And so that's it. So I welcome questions at this point, and I once again want to thank everybody for attending and hearing more about the work.
Students that are joining us, if you don't want to use your voice and video to ask a question, feel free to use the chat, and I'm happy to read your question to Whitney. Also, many of our students have seen your work first for a first time, but I would encourage everyone that's joining us to revisit the show now that you have a deeper understanding. I always like to take a second look at exhibitions after I hear the artists talk about their process and intent. So I'm anxious to see it again.
Wonderful.
I loved the presentation and all the imagery that you used in negative space. Have you ever considered using like the people that used to be there as imagery, like to void that space?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I often stay away from representing people for a few reasons. First of all, in some cases, I just haven't found deep enough archives to know who those people were. The loss of kind of that those markers of memory make it really difficult to know exactly who was there. There's a lot of wonderful artists from Detroit doing portrait-based work also, whether it be photographic or whether it be painterly. And I also kind of feel as somebody who is an outsider to the community, I sometimes worry about portraits as being viewed as sort of exploitative in terms of an outsider coming in and representing the people themselves. That already is sort of an area that's a challenge in my work is being an outsider. And I think the lens through which I choose to kind of frame that as is through this person who's sort of an inside outsider, somebody who knows that the way Detroit is often depicted is not what it actually is. And trying to kind of capture that rest of that outsider audience and presenting a viewpoint that maybe they haven't sort of considered or thought about it, and being really sort of careful to make sure to focus on this idea of empathy and the ability to recognize what has happened, and this idea of understanding the trauma that goes along with such a incredibly vast digression in terms of the city and the state of its neighborhoods. And so I think that's part of the reason I've always stayed away from portraiture. I've done portraits. I really enjoy portraits. I'm actually teaching a figure drawing class right now, and I crave that going back in and making portrait-based work. But I think that's primarily why I stay away from it. And because there's already some really amazing artists who are in Detroit making figurative based work, like Tylon Sawyer. I'm going to promote a few of them here, and Sydney James. These are people that are just killing it and making really great images that reflect the community. And I think that's a more appropriate, those are more appropriate creators to be doing that kind of work, that are there and that are present, that are from that community. Great question, though. I love that question.
Okay, Whitney, we have a question in the chat from student Brendan Harris. He's actually attending from work right now, so he can't read his question out loud, so I'll read it for him. He writes, I'm curious if you think the city is depressed despite disagreeing with the way it was measured by other studies.
I mean, I think it depends on the definition of depressed. I think I took major issue with the word misery, because I think that is such a far end of this of the state of emotional like scale, like that's even beyond, in my opinion, depressed. And so this idea of a place as being miserable, I took issue to that. There's really vibrant, wonderful communities that are happening, and there's really exciting projects and revitalizations that are happening that everyday Detroiters are doing that are making their neighborhoods better. There's really interesting art projects and community art projects and things that are happening. So there's a lot of really wonderful things. Now, I'm not going to say that the city doesn't have real challenges. Money continues to be an issue. The tax base still hasn't fully recovered. And, you know, the promise of new industries coming into Detroit has been slow. So there are real challenges. I'm not going to say that life in Detroit is easy or that it's happy. But I think this idea of showing it just through this really tragic lens of misery, I think is something that I find problematic, because it really undercuts the vibrancy of the things that are happening in Detroit in little ways and in large.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay, so this is more of a technical question. So I'm assuming you're using the ampersand aqua board as a surface.
Yes.
They don't come in this oval shape, do they?
They do not come in the oval shape.
Yeah, so I'm assuming you're cutting them, but I'm curious if if you have any trouble with the edges, just because like the whole thing about aqua board is that surface treatment that they do to the panels.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I need to make sure I give credit where credit is due, because I know I'm going to have I have family members present, and I have family members who will probably be watching this presentation at a later date. My uncle cuts them all for me. We have a really great relationship, and he cuts them for me because they don't come in the oval shape. And so it's a challenge. He cuts them for me, and I have to sand them down to kind of smooth out the cuts. But if you see them in person, you'll notice they're not perfectly shaped. They're irregular, which I kind of appreciate. It's yet another characteristic that gives them a little bit of an individual quality. But the surface of the aqua board actually holds up pretty well. So it's you just have to be careful with the angle of the cut and the angle that you're sanding. But they're actually relatively easy to cut. I keep thinking I need to email them though and say, could you just make these in ovals for me, so I have to outsource my work? Because the idea, and that kind of touches on the goal of making a smaller scale series where I can make the works more quickly is I do want these eventually to number in the hundreds, to be more reflective of the scale of the loss. And so that's a lot of labor. I haven't talked to my uncle about this dream of it being in the hundreds, so this might be how he finds out.
Yeah, I guess the aqua board, the surface is more intact. I guess I was also thinking of like the clay board surface, where the surface does chip off very easily, around the edges. But okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
They seem to be pretty resilient. We haven't lost any yet. We haven't had any that were beyond repair. So they're pretty tough, and they're a great product. I'd never used them before
they're amazing. Yes. To have like durable surface, so you can use water media that doesn't warp or wrinkle. They're lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Great question.
Any last questions for Whitney? Oh, one more in the chat box here. Student Samantha Shockley writes, it seems you've developed your artwork for a specific niche. What led you up to specifically focusing on the architecture?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not exactly entirely sure. It's not that I loved linear perspective when I was in undergrad so much that I just really wanted to focus on it. I think I ended up focusing on it because the architecture was really the most tangible marker of change and that change of state in a city, that it became an accessible point for me to discuss evolution and change over time through these physical markers of space, and allowed me to address the issue through a way that was not about figurative work or about people in particular. Because as I sort of said with the one of the previous questions, I think there are already a lot of artists doing that and doing it better and doing it from more of an appropriate lens. And so for me, really focusing on the biggest tangible marker of absence when you come into the city is the building and the architecture or the lack of architecture. And so for me, it was really more the content, the idea that drove what the subject matter was. But I won't tell you that I signed up to originally thinking that I would be painting landscapes, that was my niche originally. And it just is kind of how the work sort of has evolved, and where I've sort of settled on at the moment. That's a great question.
This is more of like a comment because it made me appreciate your work a lot more. You said the beginning half was like more like ruin porn, and that's how you got your inspiration. So I kept thinking, man, that means a whole new meaning of revenge porn. So like
Yeah,
everything you did was that. I was like, that just made me like love it more. So I just thought that threw that out if you didn't think of that already.
yeah, I appreciate that reference. And yeah, like I said, I do take a little bit of issue with that term. It's not my term, but it was a term that was kind of going around in academics about these ruined images as being ruin porn. And then there's also related concepts about poverty porn. And that's a term often used to describe the abundance of images of Appalachia and sort of ruined homes in the Appalachian region. And so there's all these subsectors that if you kind of get into this idea of representation and place-based representation, there's all these other terms that have come up. But yeah, I think that's an interesting connection you've made.
I have one last question in that case. Like, how much of it do you think is then the problem that you have with insider versus outsider, right? Representing, it's kind of, so if it were to be somebody who is from the city, right, representing it in a similar manner as mass media, would you be more okay with it? For example, you know how like kind of how you can say critique your own family, but if somebody else does it, it's not okay, right? So
I mean, I think there's a lot of that. I think it is who's coming in, and what those representations are manifesting into. I don't necessarily know that I have an issue with the images, especially there's a lot of artists coming in and taking photographs, and the images themselves may be problematic, but in just taking an image and having it, it's different than when that image then is showing up in mediated forms. And when it's being then relied upon to construct a narrative about a place. And so I think it was that step where an image no longer is an artistic image or an image that's hounded like in kind of formal qualities, and starts to play a role of narrating what the city is. That's where I think I took the most issue with those particular images, is they were often just being shared without context. And so a great example of that is, for a number of years, there was an old high school in Detroit called Cass Tech. And there's still a high school in Detroit called Cass Tech. It's beautiful. It's this huge school. The building was built, I think, maybe 20 years ago. It's a state-of-the-art, it's an incredible school. But the old Cass Tech stood empty and abandoned next to it for a really long time. And so oftentimes they would use this image of Cass Tech in these Detroit narrative stories about, the decline of Detroit. And they'd show this picture and it was like, but Cass Tech, the brand new beautiful ones right next door, like they had to crop the beautiful picture out, like in order to get the photo that they have, they had to crop an image that undercuts their messaging and their story. And so I think more so than who is doing the representation, but where those representations are kind of ending up, I think is where my issue is. But I think that ethical line is different for a lot of people. And I think just even the status of insider or outsider is for many people where the line exists. So I think it's an interesting question. I know for me, that's where I sort of have the where my line is, but I think everyone's line is a little bit different in terms of the ethics of those. Any other questions?
Have you considered like monitoring like the good qualities of Detroit besides the stuff that's missing? I know that for example, Indiana was actually deemed one of the most depressing states, including Ohio and Detroit. So Indiana's approach was to show what we have that's good. So have you considered that for Detroit?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of thought of that because in my own work, then, you know, this focus on what's missing is itself sort of a mediated sort of specific focus on a particular area. I think the problem of that is that, as I sort of mentioned, the scale of Detroit is huge, and there have been a lot of really wonderful things happening, and there has been a lot of good coverage of that. But a lot of the things that are like new and exciting about Detroit are happening in the downtown center. A lot of the investment is happening in specific areas close to that downtown. And the economic influx of cash and of opportunities has not been equally shared, has not been experienced by people who live in the neighborhoods. And so I think for me, the reason I don't focus on that is there's already a very intensive pro-Detroit sort of PR campaign that's happening, which is great. It's been a really wonderful turn of events from the doom and gloom of media coverage from 2008 through 2012, which was just really all very negative. But for me, I think that's why I continue to kind of focus on the neighborhoods and those regions where there might still be just one or two homes existing on an entire block. Those individuals are still having some real important issues, access issues to transportation, issues with getting even their garbage picked up, issues not getting quick response times from police because there's just too big of a city to patrol properly. And so for me, focusing in on those neighborhoods and kind of focusing my lens on that is actually meant to kind of just keep our attention on the areas where there's still a lot of issues and where there's still a lot of loss. And it's sort of a timely thing is that with every image I'm taking and then creating, a year later that house could be gone. And so it requires that kind of focused attention on it in order to capture what exists in any kind of way that's recognizable. That's a great question, though.
Well, Whitney, thank you so much for reserving this time for us today. If you want to follow Whitney's Instagram, it's WL Sage Studio on Instagram. So I encourage you to follow her work on social media, and reminder that her work will be on display through April 22nd. So you have 2 more weeks to see the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone enjoys the work. Thank you for hosting it. Thank you for being good stewards. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.